What circumstances create the need to have to prove your reserves? Do I need to prove for reserves if I'm Coinbase? What if I'm staked ETH? What if I'm, a decentralized exchange? When is proof of reserves actually applicable? In the aftermath of Mt. Gox, Bitcoin seemed like it was on its last legs. 750,000 Bitcoins seemingly vanished out of thin air, taking down the largest trading venue at the time, which once held over 70% of Bitcoin's volume of transactional trades. Prices plummeted by 65%, and confidence was at an all-time low. But amid the wreckage, the original hodlers and cypherpunks were already at work, envisioning a stronger, more resilient future for crypto. In the obscure depths of internet relay chat, Bitcoin developer Greg Maxwell, in conversations with others like Peter Todd, who HBO famously claimed to be Satoshi, outlined a revolutionary idea, that of proof of reserves. On May 8th, 2013, Maxwell described the concept. The idea is simple enough. Two halves. First, you show how much funds you should have via signed message for actual coins on chain. That's easy enough. Then you need to prove how much you should have. This is a little trickier, but ultimately it ended up being tricky, but not insurmountable, as many exchanges, auditors, and regulators have adopted proof of reserves as table stakes for the industry. Now, over time, the application of proof of reserves has broadened, now covering stablecoins, asset-backed tokens, ETFs, and more. But stablecoins and ETFs are pretty different than crypto exchanges. So when we apply the concept of proof of reserves to those different use cases, how does it work? Does it provide the same assurances? Today, we're diving into the evolution and new applications of proof of reserves. If you're invested in demonstrating legitimacy as a crypto company, these are foundational concepts you'll need to understand. Welcome to TNF Takes, the go-to spot for crypto companies and on-chain organizations. I'm Jeremy Now. I'm here with Nick Ward and Noah Buxton from the network firm. We're here to help you establish trust, build efficient crypto operations, and stay ahead of the curve in an ever-evolving industry. Nick, Noah, how are you guys doing today? How's your guys' weekend going?
80K Bitcoin makes for a great weekend.
Not too shabby, right? A good 10% pump after the election. All right.
Not bad at all.
Excellent, guys. Well, I'm very excited to talk to you today because you guys have been doing proof of reserves more than any other CPA firm or auditors in the space. So I think you'll have a lot of value and a lot of alpha to share with our crypto companies today. So we know proof of reserves was created, as a brainchild after Gox, right? After all these problems shown themselves. So we know it's pretty important, but we need to figure out some of the details here. So the first thing I want to dive into is, what circumstances create the need to have to prove your reserves, right? Do I need to prove for reserves if I'm Coinbase? What if I'm staked ETH? What if I'm, a decentralized exchange? When is proof of reserves actually applicable? So Noah, you've been doing this longer than anyone. Can you shed some light onto when proof of reserves is actually, applicable?
Well, don't sell yourself short. I think you're actually one of the world's experts here, and I've done more of these in the weeds than anybody else, but I appreciate you running the interview. Proof of reserves is ultimately an asset liability matching exercise, which is sort of simple in its nature, but potentially complex in its execution. And just remember, one man's asset is another man's liability in this world. When we think about the exchange serving a function, multiple functions actually, of custodial services, essentially holding, let's just use Bitcoin, holding crypto or Bitcoin for a user, and then enabling them to trade, right, to buy or sell a different asset, and then, of course, custody the purchased asset. These things create an obligation, right? So we'll call it a customer liability or a customer obligation simply, right? The exchange owes you a Bitcoin. And this is really different than the traditional world where you deposit $100 to the bank. And yes, the bank has a customer obligation as well. They owe you $100. However, they have something else that pins that, which is a reserve requirement. And that's, set by prudential regulators and, other law. But essentially, you call it 20%, let's say, a reserve requirement. That allows the bank to go out and loan some of your money, right, and generate interest on it. in the context of crypto, we're not talking about, we're talking about bearer assets, digital bearer assets. That means they're not the same as dollars in that respect. The exchanges don't have insurance, for instance, in all cases. And so it's just a very different context. But ultimately, proof of reserves is this asset liability matching exercise, originally in the concept of an exchange environment. But the concept really applies actually to multiple things in the crypto and digital asset space, where there's a lack of transparency between the token and the underlying asset, or the asset and the customer obligation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Noah, because people don't even realize that these like IOUs are being created within the crypto system, right? Like when I have an account at exchange, XYZ, I deposit Bitcoin, right? They now have my Bitcoin and I have an IOU of Bitcoin, right? I have a credit on their database. That's a lot different than actually self-custodying yourself. So I think it highlights the importance of self-custody, but it's important for people to understand that, there's this asset liability matching exercise that needs to happen to prove that these exchanges, have all the customer funds, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that seems to be the trend, right? Like it's sometimes explicit within the terms of service that, it's 100% reserved on customer deposits. And other times it's sort of maybe not, but it seems to be implied, right? I think crypto users, when they go and use a centralized platform for custody and exchange, I think they assume that it's reserved, right? Unless they're specifically taking a step for like a lending product, for instance, where they know, okay, I'm depositing a Bitcoin, but some portion of that is going to be used to generate yield.
Yep, certainly. That's interesting because you bring up other use cases where proof of reserves might be applicable, right? Like, okay, spot, I think it was the first application of proof of reserves and it's relatively simple to understand. But then the concept of proof of reserve started being applied to different use cases. So, Nick, you've been doing these for other different types of instruments. Can you let us know, how did this go from being a proof of full reserve for exchanges being applied to these different concepts in the digital asset ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all, even folks that joined the space after Mount Gox, I feel like that's the one kind of event that everyone at least knows a little bit about. In crypto, it feels like 1 year, 7 years, but that still seems to stick in the minds, and rightfully so, right? It was really the only exchange at the time. All these customers lose their money, as you mentioned, 750,000 Bitcoin lost.
Now
So
it's like Docs and FTX are like the two
right.
pillar points.
Unfortunately, yeah, we've had it again. So it's like this lesson should be getting ingrained in us, right? But beyond the exchanges, as the industry evolved, exactly to your point, you have these other products that still a proof of reserve should be required and should be the bar to set, right? So we have stable coins. You go back to that asset liability. If I'm going to put $1 in to tokenize on chain, that dollar sits there and needs to be proven out at some point. So we go well beyond into several other products, the ETFs, real world assets getting added are all going to be examples of proof of reserves that can start to come into play and frankly should be expected.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I think, we realize, okay, this same concept now it needs to be more widespread. And we want to get into some of the weeds of that because maybe people don't understand how it looks, right? We briefly talked about the exchange example, and we want to dive back into that too. But we want to understand the nuts and bolts of how proof of reserves works for different types of situations. But let's maybe start with square one, the first application of proof of reserves. Noah, can you tell us, we briefly talked about depositing a Bitcoin and, you get an IOU, but can you shed a little bit of light of how a proof of reserves, what are the key components for a proof of reserves for an exchange, for example?
Yeah, for sure. So there's those two sides of the equation, assets and liabilities. Let's talk about the assets first. These exchange environments are actually pretty complex animals. There's a lot of homegrown systems that are used, and they're, of course, crypto native. And so they have that complexity as well. Generally speaking, exchanges pool customer assets into sort of omnibus wallets would be one way to say it. There's sort of a layer of cold storage, probably something warm, in the middle that enables customer withdrawals and deposits, and then specifically deposit addresses as well. But in any case, you're talking about per asset, you're talking about really one or a small collection of wallets that hold all of the customer assets. So your Bitcoin goes in the pool with everybody else when you deposit it. So on the asset side, that creates a need to create a ledger, right? On the other side, sort of marking, okay, who's in the pool, right? Who came into the pool first? How much did you throw into the pool? How much have you taken out of the pool? What's your net that you're owed out of that omnibus wallet? And the way exchanges deal with that is with, on the liability side, or what they owe customers, is they create an exchange customer database. And it really is just that. It's a SQL database. Sometimes it can be a NoSQL database, but ultimately it's a traditional database that you'd find in many other kinds of tech companies, which just records customer activity, right? So sort of customer account, what the assets that they've deposited, withdrawn, bought, or sold, and their other sort of demographic and other activity on the platform. And so what you have is, sort of looking at the wallet itself, no idea who is owed, the Bitcoin in that wallet. You have to pair that with the customer liabilities on the internal ledger to be able to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a great point, Noah. It's interesting because like a lot of people say, just look on chain. But on an exchange, most of the activity is just solely lives on that ledger, right? Like if me and you trade on an exchange, there's nothing on chain for that, right?
Exactly.
So it's
That's a
all,
big misconception. That is a really big misconception. People think when they're, sort of in the trading view, and they're actually, watching the charts and they're trading, they think that that's on-chain activity, and it is 100% not on-chain activity. It's all on the order book, so to say, all in the database.
yeah, certainly. I mean, you could think of the transaction fees those exchanges would be having to pay if those are all on chain. But I think that brings us to next, to kind of moving away from centralized exchanges. And that actually, you do have to pay those fees on DEXs and like these lending protocols. But before we get there, I think the next most relevant, or the next evolution of proof of reserves, was being applied to stablecoins, right? As Tether promulgated and more stablecoins started being launched, close to 2020, the stablecoin proof of reserves became a thing, really. So, Nick, you've been doing stablecoin attestations for 5, 10 issuers. How does a proof of reserves apply in that set of circumstances?
Yeah, so stable coins a little bit different, right? So I mean, at their foundational level, a stable coin is going to be, we'll use the USD example. So $1 in the bank will be minted to one token on chain, and then that token can move freely throughout the system. And what's a little different from one end is that those liabilities. So on the exchange, we mentioned we need to get the exchange customer liability list. The stablecoin issuer may not necessarily have that specific customer liability, right? This is a need to be able to redeem at any point one token for $1, but that might not be to the same customer. The person that minted may go ahead and trade that stablecoin for Bitcoin, and now they're no longer interested in redeeming. But the fact remains that we need to make sure the issuer is able to redeem when it comes down to it, and someone does come knocking to do that. And of course, stable coins, it doesn't cost zero to issue these and maintain them. So what they're doing is usually taking that cash, keeping a good solid portion in cash, maybe a higher yield savings or some other money market type, and then maybe some short-term treasury so that they can earn yield, fund their operations, and continue maintaining the database. And so the proof of reserves here is to come in and make sure that tokens on chain are backed by the dollars, treasuries, short-term money markets in their account, and therefore can be redeemed at any time.
Can we smush the two ideas together real quick? So we've got an exchange over here, and they have a stable coin or more listed. Let's say it's just that $1 stable coin, right? Over here, you've got a stable coin issuer, and in the middle, you have a customer, okay? How does the customer get access to a stable coin? In the vast majority of circumstances today, the customers don't have a direct relationship or account with the issuer itself. They have purchased a stable coin on a third-party exchange, and the exchange actually has a relationship with the issuer. So the type of reporting that Nick is talking about gives sort of this holistic whole environment, sort of how many tokens are out there and are they sufficiently backed at a point in time by cash equivalents, right? US dollars roughly, although a lot of the holdings will be treasuries, right? And so it's just, as from the customer view, it's just interesting that there's, when you're looking at this type of reporting, you have to understand, yes, it's speaking to the whole reserve, the reserve of the sort of issuer's system in total, but you don't necessarily have a right to directly redeem. And so The exchange's proof of reserves is a layer in this equation, right? Like if you hold a significant value on the exchange, you kind of want to know that the stablecoin itself, that ecosystem is reserved, but you also need to know that the exchange you're using is actually holding those stablecoins, because they might not be on your behalf, right? They may be under reserved on the stablecoin side, or using those instruments, using those stablecoins for yield or other corporate purposes, which really, sort of gets into this idea of like a nested proof of reserves. Yeah.
Yeah. So as basically as a stable coin holder on an exchange, you are relying on two parties now. You need the exchange to be fully reserved with your stable coins, and you need the stable coin to be fully reserved by cash in the bank. So it becomes this daisy chain, right?
Exactly.
This layered financial system, like naturally evolved in traditional finance. Now it's being built in crypto. Very interesting.
100%. Yeah.
And
Speaking
that's
of
like to
tradition,
that point real quick. Yeah. Just so you made that traditional analogy. That's a great way to think about proof of reserves in its very simplest sense, right? Is you have existing financial system, tons of regulations, tons of third parties, tons of audit and assurance, right? A whole market around that's been developed over hundreds of years. And then you have crypto trying to rebuild something new, right? And it's adopting maybe some best practices, or maybe getting some regulation that's, sort of similar activity, similar regulation, right? But proof of reserves, is building in this new financial system the transparency that's required. You can't do exactly the same thing you can do for a bank audit, for instance. These kind of tools are part of this new financial stack.
that's what we were promised, right? The auditability of blockchains create a whole new level of transparency. But
Exactly.
talking about traditional finance, you bring up, I want to dovetail to the next kind of product that hovers the two lines, and that's the Bitcoin or crypto ETFs. Proof of reserves seems like it could also be applicable here, but it might look a little bit different. No, we've been working with ETFs for the last few years. How does a proof of reserves look for like a Bitcoin ETF, for example?
Yeah, it's I guess you could think it's a little bit like the exchange context in one sense, that the issuer is holding the asset on your behalf. Except in this case, the liability isn't just on a database. I mean, it is on a database, but it also is a security or a note that is issued and traded on some marketplace, or traditional securities exchange, and dealt with by brokers. And so, yeah, it's a bit easier, I would say, than the exchange context, because you've got sort of pretty two reliable sides of the ledger, right? You've got securities, notes outstanding, created and issued by the issuer, and then you've got verifiable custody of digital assets that you can go to, on-chain assets that you can look at and do that asset liability matching.
And this calls back to your point on the last one with the daisy chain, right? Because the ETF issuer, we want to make sure they've purchased the Bitcoin to back the securities, but where are they holding those Bitcoin, right? Okay. I think Coinbase has 8 out of 10 or something right now where they're housing all of the Bitcoin reserves for these ETFs. So again, the industry can sit back and go, all right, well, I see that the ETF has purchased my Bitcoin, but where does it live? Is there a proof of reserves at that level?
Yeah, that's a great point. And thanks, guys. ETFs, right? We went back to TradFi land, but now the narrative this cycle seems to be all about RWAs, tokenized assets, RWAs. Like it's going to change everything. It's going to change finance. Citibank, BlackRock, everyone's talking about RWAs, right? But you always think, well, how does this tokenized house? How does it get on chain? I know I was jogging my mind as I was trying to think about tokenized assets of how does that actually work. So Nick, can you how does this work, right, for like a tokenized asset, right? Like, is proof of reserves applicable here too?
Absolutely, yeah. So RWAs, for our listeners that don't know, real world assets, right? That's what we're talking about. So Jeremy mentioned a housing example. I think that one's pretty complicated because there's a lot of tax and regulatory that come with it. Certainly is being done and will continue to be, but I'm going to use gold as our example here. And so step one is, hey, we're going to tokenize gold, meaning the vault, the issuer is going to purchase gold in a vault and represent that with tokens on chain. Some examples we've seen have been at like the troy ounce level is what the token represents. And so what's the reason for that? Hey, gold is tough to trade realistically, right? If I want to purchase gold and be selling it, I'm usually doing it through another vehicle, ETFs being one example. But if I really wanted to trade ownership of that asset, it means it's moving, it needs to get checked. all these things that come with it. So the tokenization of it offers, hey, let's represent ownership via tokens and be able to trade that much more freely. Now, again, it kind of calls back to the stablecoin example of how do I know the issuer who I can ultimately redeem with if I wanted to go ahead and say, I've got these tokens and I want to take the gold into custody for my own. How do I know they have it, right? So our job is to come in and make sure that gold in the vault is at a level equal or greater to those tokens on chain.
Yeah, it's a great point. It starts to get really clear that how important proof of reserves is when you start thinking about all the different asset liability pairs in the system. Like we went over the big ones today, like stablecoins, ETFs, exchanges, of course, and now RWAs being like the newest narrative. But it can even be applied in other situations. Like think about like wrapped BTC or the new KBTC by Kraken, or even blockchain bridges, right? As you're pegging in and pegging out, like those need to match, and it just becomes so apparent. But what's funny is that the concept of proof of reserves. There's no reason that it couldn't be applied in our current financial system. Of course, banks are different; they have reserve requirements. But think about Venmo, for example. They're holding platform tokenized dollars on our behalves. Why aren't they doing a proof of reserves to confirm that they actually have all the customer cash? Or, security like Robinhood. Do they have all the securities on the back end? I hope so. I think so, but I don't know so. Right. So I think crypto has an opportunity to lead here in transparency. And who knows? Maybe we'll see it even applied to other industries going forward.
I love that you bring up that point. So I think there's this interesting, potential like innovation about proof of reserves. It's new, it's evolving still. It means different things to different people. It can apply in different ways. It's a little bit complicated. But like once this is figured out and more widely adopted, don't you think the onus will be on TradFi to do the same thing? And then you'd say, wait a second, well, I thought you said it was different. It has to be a digital asset component. Well, not necessarily, because like in an exchange context, you think about this customer liability database. This is the biggest problem point in the exchange is going in and, knowing that it's a homegrown database, and there's not a lot of ways to get comfort over it. And so we use this Merkle tree to actually enable customers to verify themselves, right? They can go through and say, was I included with the right liability number on the right asset at this point in time? That's very powerful, right? And so I love to think about the example of Wells Fargo. I forget how many years ago it was now, right? But where they were actively perpetrating fraud against their customers by opening false credit lines, unauthorized credit lines, and credit cards. Wow, what if a Wells Fargo customer could go through and through a cryptographic Merkle proof actually show at a point in time, this is what the bank said that I owed them or they owed me, or my credit lines existing were. That is a way of bringing retail and customer participation into institutional reserves and institutional behavior and reporting that I think is 100% something that should be included in our future.
Great points. And you mentioned it, thinking about the future of proof of reserves, right? Hopefully this becomes applied to, more than just crypto. But what else is in the cards for the future of proof of reserves, in your opinion? Where is this going to go?
Well, we talked about the token, the RWA, which I think of if this term RWA isn't super familiar to you yet, I think about asset-backed token maybe is something that we've used before. I think that's probably the highest order of it. But a real-world asset token, right, is going to be tokenizing all things, commodities, potential other financial instruments, real-world assets like commercial property or residential investment property, things like that. I think that there's another avenue of proof of reserves that we've worked on and that we support clients with, which is the on-chain piece, right? So for a tokenized asset, again, we talked about you can have, let's say, the stable coin or the gold token, right? Here's the number of circulating tokens for ounce tokens, right? And here's the actual gold in the vault, showing the ecosystem is reserved. But there's another very powerful mechanism that proof of reserves can uncover, which is what we in the accounting world call an internal control or control, generally speaking, right? Is the idea that you can start to automate controls. What if a smart contract can actually look to the reserves at a point in time and say, hey, are there enough reserves for me to mint these new tokens based on customer deposits. Yes, customers have deposited more gold or they've deposited more dollars and they want to mint stablecoins. Can the issuer do that? The smart contract is, like a vending machine, right? And it can determine, if it can do that simple programmatic check on reserves. And so that's something that's available through Chainlink's decentralized Oracle network, and something that we support from the data aggregation component of it, ensuring that multiple custodians, we can pull in all the asset data, and one or more chains, we can pull in the liability data and provide a single unified POR check, essentially proof of reserves check.
It's a great point, because we've spent all this time thinking about how we can actually get the information related to a proof of reserves. But now, once we have it, what can we do with it, right? And I think that is the next evolution that you pointed out, Noah. It's like, okay, once we have this, now we can actually build in protections into the system, literally at the code level. So I think that's a huge innovation. It's, I'm pretty excited to see where that goes over time.
Yeah.
And it looks like another big happening related to proof of reserves is movement on the regulatory front. And like how things started with exchanges, it looks like they're potentially moving to proof of reserves for exchanges in different jurisdictions, such as Texas and Wyoming. Wyoming even includes the Merkle tree within the law, which was amazing. Just shows how forward-thinking they are. We also, of course, in the stablecoin context, I think there's been a lot of evolution over the years. The one that comes to mind first is New York. They have their stablecoin requirements, where they have a monthly attestation, which includes the month end and a day within the month, right, to be included within those reportings. And I know Dubai, Canada, a bunch of other jurisdictions around the world are drafting legislation related to proof of reserves. They either say it outright, or they use a pseudonym like, asset liability reconciliation or customer asset reconciliation or something like that. And I think the ultimate proof of reserves might be this U.S. Bitcoin strategic reserve. Loomis, in her draft bill, includes a quarterly proof of reserves requirement. So, Miss Loomis, Mr. Trump, feel free to hit us up. We've been doing proof of the reserves the longest. So if you're looking for someone to help you on that front, let us know. Happy to do it to support the country, to be a patriot. But thanks, guys, so much for your time. I appreciate it. I think there was a lot of alpha for our users here today and a lot of understanding gained about proof of reserves. Where else could they learn more about proof of reserves? Do you have any good resources for our listeners today, Nick or Noah?
Yeah, you can.
Good.
You can check out, tnf.com. We've got a lot of our thought leadership there, and some of that includes work we've done with the Digital Chamber, where there's a comprehensive proof of reserves guide that really will give you everything you need to know. I believe version 2.0 is out now, which covers a lot of the topics we've talked about today in a lot more depth.
Yeah, just for that one, just Google the Digital Chamber proof of reserves, and you'll get a blog type post and a link to download the full paper. And that is sort of the treatise. That's the world's most comprehensive treatment of proof of reserves for all types of practitioners, from regulators to technical developer types, product managers, CPAs as well. It does a lot, for helping CPAs understand probably the 3, 4, 5 levels deeper than what we already talked about today, right? We really just skimmed the surface of proof of reserves across the main sort of verticals or types. But really within each of those, what's the type of reporting? What's the standard, right? All these things come to play. And I think, for our listeners today, like management should look to that resource. It's a really, it's been organized so that management can kind of find its way through a very long document, like what sections are really relevant for management. But understanding how proof of reserves applies to the transparency issues in your business and how you can sort of solve those, or, how you can build a program around them for users, I think is competitive edge. So
yeah, I think that was the first place where we actually saw the other proof of reserves use cases like outlined for stablecoins, ETF.
I'd also mention Nick Carter's got a proof of reserves resource page where he tracks, who's doing them, even if the exchange is doing self proof of reserves all the way from third parties. So I'd encourage people to check that out as well.
Yeah, I think he's been rating them for a while now. So yeah, couldn't go a proof of reserves episode without mentioning Nick. Thank you for your contributions. But thanks, guys. Appreciate your time today. Looking forward to the next TNF Take. If you have any crypto companies or on-chain organizations who listened and want to explore more about proof of reserves, feel free to hit us up, and we'd be happy to provide you with more information. Thanks again, guys.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, guys.